Okay. Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's an honor to be here. I'm delighted to be part of this group that's here to celebrate Christina's work and to recognize the importance of your contributions to these and many other discussions. So it's just lovely to be here. And to think about this question of the transition to the pluriverse, and particularly the problems, which was very richly opened this morning, the question of political ontology or competing political ontologies or ontologies of the political. And I have been thinking about this, and we'll talk today about this problem and the site, the anti-globalization movements as a site for contesting ontologies of the political, and also as a site of the eruption of the pluriverse. But in a way that I think is extremely fraught and conflictual and contradictory, in which these competing political ontologies are present, they're co-present, but they are also in very significant tension, and in which the modern political, the ontology of the modern political, is constantly reasserting itself in the name of global justice. So just to briefly outline what I'm going to do in the next 20 minutes, I want to talk about the World Social Forum as a particular site of the eruption of the pluriverse, and also as an instantiation of a new modality of the political that represents a significant shift from, in some respects, from the modern political on the left, on the global left. But secondly, to also note the divide in the World Social Forum and other spaces like this between the modern and the subaltern, and the character of subaltern incorporation into the project of global justice as we see it at the World Social Forum. Thirdly, to describe an example of where I see political ontologies in contestation, and that is over the discourse of civilizational crisis that has appeared in the global justice movements over about the last 6 or 7 years. And then just end with a few conclusions about where I think that leaves us. So just to start, in terms of thinking about the anti-globalization movement as a site for the eruption of the pluriverse, one, I guess, powerful starting point for thinking about the pluriverse has been the Zapatistas. And the Zapatistas, as I'm sure you know, appeared dramatically on the world stage in the mid-1990s. And one of their very iconic claims was that they were struggling for a world where many worlds would fit. And it was in the context of really a life and death struggle against neoliberalism. And understanding neoliberalism and the project of neoliberal globalization as a project for the suppression of the possibility of multiple worlds in the name of a project for a single world. And this was expressed most succinctly really by Margaret Thatcher in the 80s, saying there is no alternative. This project of neoliberal globalization is the path of the future, and there is no alternative. And it was to that claim by Margaret Thatcher that the Zapatistas and later the many strands that converged in the global justice movement and the World Social Forum asserted, no, another world is possible, not just Margaret Thatcher's world. Another world is possible. And I think in the almost 20 years now since the appearance of the World Social Forum, that claim, another world is possible, has itself been complexified and pluralized to become the notion that other worlds are possible. Not just a single other worlds plural are possible, and indeed other worlds are already existing. So the project of the World Social Forum, in many respects, I think, represents a new modality of the political on the global left that in part embraces this kind of sense of a search for a world in which many other worlds can fit. And the Social Forum, in a certain sense, represents some really significant breaks in the history of the history of the modern left, in the sense that it is a very, it's an embrace of the practice of open space, of the notion of many diverse movements opposed to neoliberalism gathering together in a common space, but in a way in which their diversity was maintained and celebrated, and in which any attempt at a kind of hegemonic unifying of those movements was rejected. And so pluralism and diversity became very the kind of hallmarks of this kind of open space. And the project of the World Social Forum, in bringing together these movements in an anti-authoritarian and non-violent politics, was also a critique, represented a critique of the politics of the old left as itself authoritarian and itself violent, and the signaling a desire and a need to break with that. The World Social Forum is also represented by a politics of autonomy from political parties and from state projects. It reflects a turn to the social and away from the state in a kind of rejection of the hegemonic politics represented by statist projects, and an embrace of the self-organizing capacities of civil society. So the kind of valorizing of the autonomous self-organizing capacities of the social versus the coercive powers of the state. So in a lot of ways, the World Social Forum and the movements within it represent a significant shift or an eruption sort of within the modernist emancipatory traditions of Western modernity. But in other ways, there are still really troubling continuities. And that's what I want to talk about. And that's what I think becomes really apparent when we look to the presence of subalternized movements within that space that is putatively egalitarian and inclusive, but which continue to incorporate subalternized movements in very subordinate kinds of ways. So within the Social Forum, I make a distinction between the kind of modern emancipatory forces and subalternized movements. And by subalternized movements, I'm talking about movements that are really on the exteriority of the modern political. These are tribal peoples, indigenous peoples, slum dwellers, Dalits, or the so-called untouchables of South Asia. These kinds of movements have been very present and present increasingly on the terrain of global justice or in the anti-globalization movements, but they're incorporated in very subordinated ways. And that has to do with both their really profound structural marginality that has to do with their poverty, with their economic marginality, but it also has to do with the epistemic hierarchies that continue to mark the politics of a space like the World Social Forum, that are often unrecognized. They are there, they haunt the dynamics between movements, but they're very, very unrecognized by the dominant movements, which are the movements of the kind of Western emancipatory traditions, by which I really understand movements that are variously aligned with socialisms, anarchisms, feminisms, liberalisms, these dominant traditions, emancipatory traditions of Western modernity. Nevertheless, I would still say that the Social Forum is a place where we can see this kind of fraught, conflictual transition to the pluriverse is underway, because subalternized movements are erupting in this kind of space, and their claims are growing. One example, just to sort of talk about the dynamics of the interactions between these kinds of movements, really became apparent to me in 2009. In 2009, at the World Social Forum, it was held in the Amazon, in Brazil, in Belém, Brazil. And this was a moment in the history of the World Social Forum process when indigenous peoples were more visible and more present than they had ever been before. And they were there, like there were several, probably 5,000 indigenous people there. And they had their own space. They had their own physical space within the forum, and they were also moving through the other spaces in the forum. And one of the major discourses of that moment in the social forum process was a discourse of civilizational crisis. Now, in 2009, you will recall, this was 1 year after the major meltdown on Wall Street. And so the language of crisis was everywhere. And however, the language of civilizational crisis was a contribution in the social forum brought by indigenous peoples. And I just want to outline for you what that meant. So in the social forum in Brazil that year, there were at least 2 different indigenous discourses of civilizational crisis, and they map onto what Christina was talking about earlier, about the differences between lowland peoples and highland peoples. So in the social forum in Brazil, the indigenous peoples of the Amazon, which are lowland people, talked about the crisis, not of Wall Street, not of the financial crisis, but a crisis that was 510 years old. A crisis which was the crisis of the conquest, the crisis of survival of indigenous peoples in the face of the conquest. And for them, their talk of crisis was a crisis facing the survival of the forest. And the project had to be about saving the Amazon and saving the forest. And they, as indigenous peoples of the Amazon, saw themselves as guardians of the forest and carriers of millennial knowledges that were essential to the survival of the forest. And the survival of the forest was intimately connected with their survival as indigenous peoples of the Amazon. And their politics in the social forum was all about, as Christina was talking about, defense of their territories, their claims for self-determination, their claims for autonomy. And that the response to this kind of crisis was the need to restore a global equilibrium that had been lost. And that their defense of the Amazon was a defense of the Amazon as the mother of all human beings, and that these indigenous people of the Amazon had a responsibility to all to protect her. So that was one discourse of crisis and response to crisis. Another discourse of crisis came from the indigenous peoples of the highlands, from the Andean highlands. And as Mario was referring to earlier, these indigenous peoples have been quite dominant vis-a-vis the lowlands indigenous people, and their struggles and their politics are quite interpolated with Marxism. And so the indigenous people of the Andes, of the highlands, talked about the same threats to Mother Earth, which is also a threat to the whole of humanity, but they positioned their struggle as a struggle against capitalism. In other words, the civilizational crisis was a crisis that had been created through colonial capitalism, and that their response to that was a struggle against capitalism, and very much in the tradition of the kind of modernity coloniality perspective in Latin America, talking about the need to decolonize power, knowledge, and being. Their declaration as indigenous peoples had to do with describing this crisis, the civilizational crisis, as a crisis of Western civilization, its capitalist development, and its modernity. But they, like the Amazonian indigenous people, understood the crisis as one of 500 years. So their temporal horizon was vastly different, was a 500-year horizon, and in which was included, concerns like the conquest, the slave trade, history of the slave trade, the history of genocide, and so on. So this is the kind of the 2 indigenous discourses of crisis. Now, when we move to kind of non-indigenous discourses of crisis in the same space of the social forum, where everybody uses the term crisis and everybody thinks they're talking about the same thing, the non-indigenous movements are talking about the crisis of capitalism. They're not talking about Mother Earth. They're not talking about the Amazon. They're talking about capitalism. And they're talking about the crisis that happened in 2008, not the one that happened 500 years ago. Okay? So right away, we're talking, right? In terms of understanding what kind of crisis we're here to talk about. For the non-Indigenous movements, the crisis was linked to neoliberalism. It was understood as a systemic crisis of the world system. And the civilizational crisis was understood as not as a crisis of Western civilization, but a threat to civilization itself, global, human, universalizing understanding of what is civilization. So there are quite different understandings here of crisis and also of civilization. So for the Indigenous people, civilization is understood as something plural, that there are plural civilizations, and that their civilizations as Indigenous peoples are the ones that have been under assault from Western civilization. And so the crisis of civilization is a crisis of Indigenous survival. For the non-Indigenous left, the crisis of civilization is this universal kind of crisis of capitalism, very undifferentiated understanding of civilization. The Indigenous discourses, in this case, in the space of the social forum, is an example of what Mary Louise Pratt calls auto-ethnographic interventions, in the sense that these Indigenous people are on this space of global civil society. They're talking with non-Indigenous actors. They're, in many ways, they're trying to make an intervention. They're trying to speak a language to others who are non-Indigenous. But they have to try to do it in a dominant discourse that's not really their own. But in the meantime, there's this kind of partial connection, right? There's misapprehension and there's partial connection. But it's also a space of asymmetrical power relations. And this really became clear 2 years later in the next social forum, because the language of civilizational crisis continued into the next social forum, which was 2 years later in Dakar. And what happened there was something quite extraordinary. And that was that among the non-Indigenous movements, the language of civilizational crisis had become generalized. And for them, the civilizational crisis was this universal crisis facing the whole of humanity and calling for a new universalism. And in that discourse, the Indigenous meanings of civilizational crisis had completely disappeared, had completely dropped out. And the specificity of the crisis of Indigenous survival and of their claims to territory, autonomy, self-governance, and their survival as Indigenous peoples, all that content had just kind of been effaced. Yeah. Sorry, I just lost my place here. Let me just find my spot. Yeah. So what I wanted to say about this is that this sort of contesting ontologies seem to me to be at work here, is that in this space of global justice, which is characterized by pluralism and diversity and a seemingly embrace of plural alternatives, there is this constant kind of misrecognition and effacement and erasure of subalternized ways of thinking about the pluriverse. And where this leaves us, I think, is in terms of Hans Martin's point this morning about the project of this kind of self-effacing, the need for kind of self-effacing in the episteme of Western modernity. And in a space like the social forum, which on one hand is a space of the eruption of the pluriverse, there is a constant kind of re-establishing of the power of the modern political. And it's this that has to be problematized. And there are I see three sort of different aspects of this. One is the problem of history, memory, and forgetting. And so here it's about, for the indigenous people, a 500-year history versus these much more proximate histories of the non-indigenous movements. And the insistence of the indigenous peoples in remembering the history of the conquest and the history of colonial violence, which constantly gets effaced in non-indigenous projects of global justice. Secondly, the need to recognize the colonial character of the modern political, including on the left. So in these emancipatory movements, the modern political still provides the kind of horizon of emancipatory politics. So the taken for granted character of the nation state, the national scale, citizenship, rights, entitlements in civil society, and so on, versus the kind of politics of self-sufficiency, autonomy, and territory represented by these indigenous movements. And in that kind of shift, this kind of appropriation of the discourse of civilizational crisis by the non-indigenous movements, we can see again the kind of persistence of, I think Mario, in that little debate that happened this morning, this persistence of a desire for the fundamentals, that persistence of a search for a universalist politics and a universalist way of understanding the struggle that includes all of us, that effaces subaltern difference and continues to efface subaltern difference without really seeing that it's doing so. And finally, how the discourse of diversity actually is complicit in that. That the discourse of diversity becomes a politics of undifferentiated difference when it says that in this plural and diverse space, we're all in this together, as opposed to really seeing how different peoples and movements are differently positioned vis-a-vis colonial histories, and how critical that is to actually midwifing the pluriverse. That there is no, in my view, there is no pluriverse without recognizing coloniality and colonial difference. And if we don't do that, we're in danger of enabling a kind of liberal pluriverse that reproduces a kind of liberal universalism and effaces these subaltern realities. So I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you very much, Janet.